Now, your textbook also introduces the idea of the custom complex, which comes with a fairly complicated definition. A customary practice and the beliefs, values, sanctions, rules, motives, and satisfactions associated with it. I'm going to use gender as a example of custom complex in order to just simplify it for you. I find if you find a really simple definition for something, it just makes the whole definition make much more sense. Parents attempting to foster traditional gender roles in their children. That is a typical practice in our culture that is based on cultural beliefs. The text uses dating as an example, a really great example, because depending on if somebody lives in an I'm going to have trouble saying this the whole time, individualistic culture or collectivistic culture, in a developed or developing country, in a modern westernized society or a more traditional one, all of these factors will affect the custom complexes of dating. Even though we have access to the internet, and because of that, to so much information about other societies and other ways of doing things, we get so used to the way things happen in our immediate society, I think we actually forget sometimes that just because we do things one way based on one set of beliefs, that doesn't mean everybody in the world sees it the same way. So in Canadian and American society, we believe it is completely normal and expected for a young person to be interested in dating at a certain age, and for them to have the most decision-making power regarding who they date and who they eventually marry, based on our individualistic cultural beliefs. If we look at other countries, for example, India, where it's still common for many young people to not only allow their parents to choose a marital partner for them, but for many young people to want their parents to choose a marital partner for them. This also clearly directly affects their dating customs. So just because our custom complex regarding dating and marriage seems to be normal or justified or correct, or the right custom complex, they seem to be ontogenetic, something that occurs as a result naturally because of maturation. That doesn't mean that every culture has the same custom complex. By the way, just a little tidbit here. When I searched custom complex to try to find a visual, apparently it's the name of a symbol with a drum set. So you'd be kind of surprised some of the pictures that come up when I search these terms. Now, your textbook goes into detail about Aborigines in Australia, and I think this is a great example, in part because there are a lot of similarities with the historical experiences of Aborigines in Australia with First Nations people in Canada. Um, until the early 20th century, the Aborigines of Australia were nomadic hunters and gatherers, just like First Nations people in Canada. So there's a lot of commonalities between Indigenous Aboriginal Australians. In addition, there's a lot of diversity among the different Indigenous communities there. They each have their own mixture of cultures and customs and languages. So even though I'm talking about them as one large group, just please be aware that there are uniquenesses, if that's a word, between different Aboriginal groups. So traditionally, Indigenous Australians had no settled residence. They didn't live in just one place. They moved their communities from one place to another according to the seasons, availability of food, again, just like many First Nations people in Canada did. And a key part of traditional adolescent socialization among the Aborigines involved the ritual teaching of a set of cultural beliefs known as the law. At that time, the law was generally an explanation of how the world began, but it also included pretty specific instructions for how the younger generation should be treated and involved various ritual ceremonies. So these included a circumcision ritual, and that was considered in one way an initiation right into manhood. The law included moral regulations, for example, for how marriages would be or how intimate relationships would be structured. So there were rules about who could be intimate with whom, who could marry whom, and it was viewed as best as if marriages were arranged by parents. more than by the young people themselves. So, what about adolescents specifically? Well, for adolescents, the law would be presented in a series of three public ceremonies, and each ceremony would represent a stage of passing into manhood. So each ceremony was kind of like an initiation rite. Now, this applied to girls as well, but only males participated in these ceremonies. And of course, because this was the norm so long ago, I did the best I could with visuals. So, the whole community would attend these ceremonies, and following them, these adolescent boys would be expected to be secluded for a period of time. They would not be given a lot of provisions, and they would have almost no contact with anybody else. But when this was done, they would be viewed as a man, and as such, they would have a higher status in the community. So, what this example does, looking at culture and socialization, is this illustrates how adolescents were socialized and how cultural beliefs were transmitted to them. It contained ideas about individuals and societies and divine forces. The law really focused on self-regulation because, with regard to sexual desire, for example, it had rules for sexual contact. The law dealt with role preparation because as adolescent boys moving into manhood, they learned what they needed to learn in order to be perceived as a man in their communities. And the law provided a source of meaning because, as I said at the beginning, it had general ideas about how the world came to be, and so forth. So this was a very collectivistic culture because a young person, both male and female, would be taught, according to the law, that they had a lot of obligations to the people around them. But then the people around them also had obligations to them. So a very interdependent kind of approach. Because their beliefs were collectivistic, this meant that their socialization was narrow. They didn't have a whole wide, broad range of choices. So conformity and obedience to the law and to the elders was emphasized. Even participating in the ceremonies would not be in question. So it wasn't even a question of, I feel like I'm ready, let's do this. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. But it was up to the elders in their society to make the decision. Now, does this still occur? In some ways. Of course, history has had an effect and globalization has had an effect. So these ceremonies still exist. An adolescent boy will still take part in them. And there's still going to be seclusion of the adolescent boy following these ceremonies. But it's very, very different. So previously, seclusion would be a couple months out on the land looking after themselves. Now it's maybe a week instead of a few months. And unfortunately, the younger generation is more resistant to learning their culture in this way, which is something that I think all cultures deal with because of globalization. Um, at the same time, to cut the young people some slack, to many of them, the law just doesn't seem relevant to the world they live in. So they're no longer a nomadic hunting and gathering society. Instead, the society they live in is one of formal education and mass media and going to work and living on a paycheck. And again, globalization has had a massive effect. So now, an Aborigine youth is likely to be strongly affected by other experiences outside of their family and not just the law, not just traditional cultural beliefs. And unfortunately, this has led to many of the modern problems of adolescence and emerging adulthood. So, substance abuse, smoking, drinking, that sort of thing. And unfortunately, just as a side note, when I say that Aborigines in Australia have a lot of commonalities with First Nations people in Canada, they really do, in terms of First Nations people in Canada first being subject to the residential school system, in addition to the 60s scoop. If you wanted to get more information on this in Australia, they're referred to as the lost generation, when Aboriginal children were simply removed from their families, and that was it, very similar to the 60s scoop. Another way of saying this is that Aborigines now grow up in a collectivistic culture, but they're surrounded by an individualistic culture that has seeped in. And when we look at a lot of the cultural beliefs many countries have, many are multicultural. I mean, Canada is a prime example of this. Our country contains a variety of smaller minority cultures with a variety of different cultural beliefs within our larger dominant Canadian culture, as does the US and Great Britain and countries in Europe. Our focus is what tends to happen regarding an adolescent in these situations. When you have this majority culture, but a minority culture existing within it, and one is collectivistic in nature, and the other is individualistic in nature, which approach tends to have the most influence? Many, many studies have shown that the cultural beliefs of minority cultures in both Canada and the US tend to be more collectivistic than the cultural beliefs of the American or Canadian majority culture. So the minority cultures tend to be more traditional, more family and community oriented, with less emphasis on individuals. The minority cultures might not be the same as they were in their country of origin, but they're still more collectivistic in nature than the West. So you've got this minority culture existing within the majority, who still put more emphasis on encouraging an interdependent self, in which a young person's sense of self is still defined more by their roles and relationships within the group, not just as an individual person. And of course, not surprisingly, the differences in beliefs or approaches between immigrant parents and their adolescent children can be a big source of conflict for them, as adolescents resist their parents' beliefs and parents feel frustrated and threatened when their children or adolescents adopt beliefs and approaches different from their own. For example, some research indicates that African American families tend to emphasize collectivistic values like obedience and respect for elders more than Caucasian families do. In Latino families, obedience to parents and obligations to family are strongly emphasized more than in the majority culture, so that adolescents in Latino families generally accept the authority of their parents and express a strong sense of obligation and attachment to their families more. In Asian American and Asian Canadian families, adolescents also tend to be more collectivistic and less individualistic than adolescents in the majority culture. Now, most Western countries have minority populations whose cultural beliefs tend to be considerably more collectivistic and less individualistic. Canada has a substantial Inuit population. Australia has a large Chinese population. New Zealand has a substantial number of Maoris. In Germany, there's a large Turkish minority culture. In France, there's a large Algerian culture. In England, there's a large Pakistani culture. And in all of these, you're going to, in some ways, have the clash between collectivism and individualism. But what happens when the socialization young people experience is not consistent across sources, so that they're in both? Yes, they're subject to narrow socialization as part of a minority group, but they also live within a majority culture that encourages broad socialization. What happens when these young people are faced with this? The socialization they experience within their family is different from the socialization they experience from other sources, like school or media or their peers or even the legal system. And this is a very real situation, not just a hypothetical one. Both Canada and the US and Great Britain are multicultural societies. So there's a lot of young people in both countries who have experienced this kind of contradictory socialization in their environment. In other Western countries as well, immigration from non-Western countries has increased. And like I said, what kind of um, influence does this have on the young people in question? Well, your textbook cites a specific study that I found really interesting. East meets West, Chinese adolescents in Australia and the United States. Definite contrast between Eastern and Western cultural beliefs. And I think because it's such a contrast, this is why it makes for such a great example. So, what the study did was look at the situation for Chinese adolescents in three different groups. Um, Adolescents whose families had immigrated to Australia or the US, and adolescents who were still living in Hong Kong. Sorry, two different groups. So, what the study did was make use of samples, including adolescents from both first generation families. So, the adolescent was born in China before they themselves immigrated, and second generation. They were born in the West, but their parents and grandparents were born in China. Um, Subjects were 15 to 18, 10th and 11th grades. And what we want to pay attention to is the results of the study, which indicated that even for first generation Chinese adolescents, which means they were actually born in China and then moved, their values and beliefs were closer to those of the white Western adolescents than to those of Chinese adolescents in Hong Kong. So, what this means then is that the majority culture, the individualistic, broad socialization of the majority culture had an absolute effect on them. These first generation Chinese adolescents living in the West placed less value on tradition and more value on outward success. So I find this really, really interesting. Um, and frankly, a very good idea for a study. Looking at it in this way, what's going to have the most difference? Now, I would be interested to know at exactly what age did the young people move to either the United States or Australia? I'd be interested to know about details such as were they immediately enrolled in school, um, some way to measure the attitude of their parents, that kind of thing. Um, but the fact is that first generation Chinese adolescents were more likely to have certain beliefs than those who actually grew up in China. And I think that's really significant. So this study provides a good example of the importance of conceptualizing socialization as a cultural process that has a variety of sources. Not only your family, but also your peers and school and community and the media, with all of these individual sources ultimately rooted in cultural beliefs. And as I said, this unfortunately results in young people sometimes feeling trapped between two cultures. And it's not just a feeling, I mean, in a very real sense, they are. They want to live their life in the same manner as the people around them, who are all part of the majority culture, which is to be expected. They want to be like everybody else and fit in, and there's nothing wrong with that. But doing that necessarily means disappointing their parents and sometimes even causing conflict with their parents. Something as simple as language. Their parents to continue to speak their native language at home. Let's say it's Vietnamese, because they want to maintain their language with their children. They don't want them to completely lose it, which is totally understandable. But at the same time, the children want to speak English and to fit in with their peers and their peers' family and to not stand out. So, a few examples of how this can really result in a clash of two perspectives. This young lady died in 2007. She was born in 1991. And she was murdered by her father and brother. And she was killed by them because of her resistance to conforming to what they insisted were traditional expectations of her. Wearing a hijab, attending an Islamic school, but she didn't want to do that. She wanted more freedom. And I want to be clear that this is completely against the teaching of Islam. Unfortunately, there seems to be a tendency to take one incident or even a few incidents and view them as representative of an entire group of people. You know, if a Christian bombs an abortion clinic and kills several people, we as a society do not then look at all Christians as terrorists. And we should do the same regarding Islam. So I bring this case up as an example of the collision of two cultural worlds. The restrictive one her Pakistani parents prescribed for her, and the westernized liberal one she tried to choose for herself. I think most people are familiar with the Shafia family, which is another example where you have young people raised in a minority culture within a majority culture. In 2009, in Kingston, Ontario, three sisters aged 19, 17, and 13, along with their father's first wife, who was 50, were found dead inside a car underwater at the Kingston Mills Lock. The girls were the daughters of their father's second wife. It was a polygamous family. Charged with the murders were their father, their mother, and their brother, who was 20 at the time, and it was labeled an honor killing. At the trial, information was presented detailing how the Shafia sisters were caught between two very different cultures with very different expectations. So they were living in Canada and as such wanted to do what other girls their age were doing. Wear the clothes they wanted to, go out with friends, date who they wanted to. Instead, their father expected them to be completely subservient to him and his ideas that included him controlling every aspect of their life, including wearing the hijab and marrying who he told them to marry. When they rebelled against their father, it was considered an insult and shameful for him. So this is another example of how minority versus minority versus majority culture, individualistic versus collectivistic, broad socialization versus narrow socialization can often not mix well and end up with tragic results.